Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of our PALS podcast series for our partnership institutions. I'm Paula, and I'm a fourth-year international hospitality and tourism management student from Germany. And I'm here as a student, but also as a PALS leader. Podcast episode topic is all about academic writing. And for that, I've invited an expert into the episode. Here with me is Lisa today. Hi, Lisa.
Hi Paula, thanks for inviting me along to be at this session. I'm Lisa and I am an effective learning advisor at the university and also the peer assisted learning coordinator. So I help students a lot, support them a lot with their academic writing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining today, Lisa. So as I said, our session today is going to be all about academic writing, and we're going to start it off by talking a wee bit about what academic writing is and kind of the role of academic writing for the university. So why do we do it? And then we'll move on to talk about a couple of other skills that are involved in academic writing and finish the podcast with some tips and tricks. Perfect. So Lisa, do you just want to start us off and maybe say your perspective on what academic writing is?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of students when they start at university aren't quite sure what is expected of them when it comes to academic writing. They know that it's a little bit different from what was expected at school, or also students who are coming from different countries or different cultures know that what's expected for them at a university in Scotland is quite different from what is expected in their own cultures. But I think some of the things that are quite important to bear in mind are the formal aspect of academic writing, so the style of the language that you don't use informal words, you don't use slang words, you don't use contractions, so things like don't, you never say don't in academic writing, you'd always say do not. Oh, and another thing which I think is quite difficult for students to get into the habit of is that you never say I, because you're not giving your opinion, you're presenting what you have learned about something. So you've done lots of reading and then you're presenting what you have read and what you have learned through that. So you're not ever putting things in your own personal I think or I feel. And I think that's something which students often find quite difficult at the start. And like I said there as well, it's based on what you're reading. So lots of reading and therefore citation and referencing is really important. And I think, Paula, you want to speak about that a little bit later as well.
Definitely. In terms of language, I just want to add that on because as an international student myself, and I remember when I first came to uni, I thought, I was a bit intimidated by that kind of aspect of academic and formal language, especially because I thought you had to sound incredibly clever and use all these big words to, make your point. And I feel like something that I've really learned there is that that's not what it is about. I feel like when you first start off, you try to do it because you've read all these academic journals or articles, and obviously there's some very smart people out there who are very good with words as well. And so you try to copy that, but the easier you phrase your sentences and what you try to, the point that you try to make, the better it usually ends up being. So I feel like that's just the learning that I've personally went through. And then it's more about, using those kind of like linking words. We learned a lot about that as well. So things like however, moreover, like nevertheless. So these I feel like are the things that make an academic writing academic, because that's not something that you would usually necessarily use in your kind of day-to-day writing and speaking.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right about not trying to sound too clever, making sure that you understand the words that you're using and you're writing in your style, formally in your style, but it is still your style. You're not writing for a journal article. The people who are writing for journal articles are probably PhD.
They're professionals.
So their language has to be, a little bit different from yours. You're an undergraduate student, so formal language, but clear, as you said, clarity is really important. And linking words help clarity because they show the connections between the different ideas that you're presenting, and that's really important, I think.
Now, you already mentioned a very important part of academic writing, kind of, using sources and the idea that we actually don't present our own opinions. I think, again, coming from high school and in Germany, when we had to write essays, it was a lot opinion based. So I would write my opinion on a topic. Obviously, you'd still use maybe pros and cons, but at the end of the day, it was kind of your own ideas and thoughts that you had. Whereas academic writing, everything that you write is really just based on what you've read. So I feel like it's that kind of learning there as well, how an academic essay or a report or whatever it is that you have to write, really you build it up from all the reading that you've done before. And I think that can be quite tricky at the beginning, especially because obviously naturally you start forming an opinion and you have an idea and you may be in support of the side of the argument or the other, but to really keep sort of a neutral language and then show maybe your opinion, towards a conclusion, but not really in the writing part of your main essay or main part of your essay, can be quite tricky. But it's something that I think you really need to keep in mind there as well.
Yeah, so it's thinking about the structure of your academic writing is really important, that you have a clear structure of the introduction where you present the background to the idea, you present almost like a map of what you are going to put in your essay. So you have this sort of, firstly, this essay will discuss, and followed by looking at, and each of these points are then in the same order as they appear in your essay. And each of these points come from the reading that you have done.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, in your conclusion, you pull all of that together to show what your perspective is and what you've learned. Yeah, so that's really important, as you said, that sort of objective presentation of the information. And that's true whether you're doing an essay or a report or a literature review. It's all that objective presentation. The one thing which is a little bit different is reflective writing. That's a very specific style of writing, and it's one of the few places in academic writing in Britain where you can use I, and you're encouraged to use I and talk from your own personal experience and what you feel about things. But it is quite a different style of writing, and you won't always have reflective writing to do as well.
No, I think as you said, there's obviously elements that are very similar across all the different styles of academic writing that we have, but there are certain differences. So, an essay is very different than a report. And I think, especially, I think you mostly just start out writing essays at university, and then suddenly someone introduces a report and you're kind of maybe a bit thrown off as a student and you're like, what is this? This is something entirely new. But I think it's important to just acknowledge that and then just do, like, QMU has resources and all types of different writing styles with specific guides that tell you this is how you write a report. There's a specific structure that you need to follow. So I feel like it's important to not just think, I'll just write this like an essay, when it's very clearly a report, to keep that in mind what your assessment is and what your teacher has asked you to do. And if you're unsure about what that specifically entails, to know that there's information out there who can kind of help you if you're feeling a bit lost.
Yeah, and I think the PALS leaders are going to do some sessions for the students in doing QMU degrees abroad as well. So especially about essays and reports and the different.
So there's going to be more information out there, exactly.
So make the most of the information that we can give you. I think is important. Paula, I think you wanted to speak about the role of the academic writing.
Yeah, I put that down when I thought about what we should talk about here today. I think because I kind of just wanted to highlight that why we write essays, or why teachers ask us to write essays. Obviously, you get an assessment for each module, and the lecturer tells you this is what you kind of have to write your essay on. But I think what the great thing about academic writing, maybe compared to an exam that you have to sit, is that any type of academic writing. So I'm usually going to say essays, but obviously it's true for reports and everything else as well. Is that it really gives you the opportunity to deepen your understanding of the module and of the topic, because obviously your lecturer are giving you your weekly lectures and you learn things there. But writing an essay really allows you to maybe delve deeper into a specific issue that is related to that topic, or just to read a bit more broadly maybe. So I really like the idea of essays compared to exams, because exams are a bit more strict. You only get tested on the things that you learned in your lectures, whereas the essays really allow you to just not branch out, because obviously you still have to stick to your topic, but just to deepen your understanding. And I think that's really great, because that allows you to kind of focus a bit on maybe issues and topics that really interest you, and allows you a bit of freedom there.
I think, like you said, it allows you to explore the topic, because when you're doing your reading for an essay, often, I mean, what we say is that you read wide and then you narrow it down. So it's giving you that opportunity to both broaden and deepen your knowledge in a way, like you said, that if you're sort of cramming for an exam, you don't do so much.
Exactly.
You're focusing on making sure you know the precise information and exact points. Yeah, so it's a good way it's a good way for the lecturers to test your knowledge and understanding, but it's a good way for you to, I think, not just broaden and deepen, but have a real long-lasting knowledge and understanding of the subject.
I think that's a difference as well, where, in coming from like a high school, teachers kind of tell you what to do, and there's only this specific things that you need to learn. But university really is about whether independence comes in as well, like your independent learning, and essays and academic writing just allow you to do that, and to allow you to, as we said, explore, deepen, broaden your knowledge on these topics, which I think that's why we do academic writing. Like, that's the role of academic writing.
The other things, Paula, I know you were talking about the other skills.
So I think it's obviously academic writing is sort of what we, as I said, we get tested on at the end of the day. This is what the lecturers mark us on, and this is what we'll get our feedback on. But I think, and that's quite a learning curve as well, that I personally had to go through as a student, is how there's so much more involved with academic writing than just actually writing whatever it is they have to do. And we already talked about that kind of like reading articles and reading journals, so that literature searching and reading is an absolutely essential skill. And I think there's going to be another podcast episode on that as well. So we might just skip that here, because there's going to be a bit more of an in-depth exploration, but that is an absolutely essential skill. But what I also wanted to just mention is note taking. So while you're reading your articles and your books and your report and everything that you read, it's really important to take notes on what these authors have found in their studies and what they say, because that in the end makes up your essay. So you write up your notes, and that's in the end is going to be your essay. So note taking is, I think, a really important skill, and there's different ways out there how you can take notes. And I think it's really important as a student to just kind of explore them a wee bit and experiment and see what suits you best. I found that my note taking has changed dramatically since I started in first year, and that's perfectly normal, because you learn and you develop. But I also think that there's sometimes, depending on the assessment that you have and the task that you're given, there's different ways to take notes that might be a bit better. So I think note taking is a really important skill to have, and something to sort of experiment on a wee bit to see what suits you.
Yeah, and I think with the note taking as well, and probably this will be repeated in other podcasts.
Yeah.
When you're taking your notes, it's really important to know where the information's come from when you are taking your notes, because like you said, Paula, you have to use that information in your essay, but any information that you use in your essay that came from something you read, you have to tell us where it came from.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure that you have the correct information, so that you can have your citations in your essay or in your report, and also that you can have the full reference in the reference list at the end. So it's making sure that any notes that you take, you know where the information came from.
Yeah. And referencing, I always call it referencing on the go, is really important there. So as soon as almost the first thing you do when you put up a journal article in your web browser is write down, the title of the article and the name of the author and those kind of things. Because if you take a note from something and then you kind of move on and you have a different thought, and then your friend calls you and a million things happen in between, and then it's so easy to just lose that information, and it's so hard to find that again. So as soon as you write down a note, you have to write down where that came from. And because I think referencing, I don't think we can really explain that in a podcast series, but there's other information out there. But obviously the university follows a certain referencing style that you have to adhere to in your essay. But while you're referencing on the go, so in your notes, it doesn't have to be the perfect type of referencing, right? As long as you know the information, where to find it, and it makes sense for you, just reference it however you want to, as long as it's done, obviously, as it's meant to be in the official document.
Yeah, that's right. It's for your own notes as you're going, and then polishing it before you submit. But I think that's something to think about as well, as you said, referencing as you go, because that helps with your time management as well. I think, because it means that you're saving time. You're not having to go back afterwards and try and work all that out. Definitely. And also citing as you go. So as soon as you put anything into a paragraph that came from a source, that you make sure you put that citation next to it. I have read drafts of students' essays before, when they've come to me for advice, and they'll have maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs and there are no citations in the paragraphs. The citation, in case you don't know, a citation is where you've used information from a source, and next to that you say that it's from Smith 2020, which means that the author's surname was Smith and the article was written in 2020. And in the reference list you have the full information with the title of the article and where you can find it and so on. And when I've seen students' essays, a whole sort of 3 or 4 paragraphs with no citation, and I say, well, where's your citation? And they say, I'll put it in later. But I think, how can you put it in later? You've then got to go back, and you're doubling your work at least by having to go back and find who you got the information from and putting it in. So you should, like you said, Paula, you said you have your notes and you create your essay from your notes. And as you're doing that, you're putting in the citation as you go, which is really important. Yeah,
I think what kind of ties in with the note-taking and referencing and all of that as well is paraphrasing, which basically, paraphrasing, if I have to put it into my own words, is putting something that you read in a different source, so in a book or in a journal article, into your own words. Because anytime you directly copy someone else's words, which is fine to do occasionally, you have to clearly mark that as a quotation, and you have to specifically say what page you found it on and those kind of things. And so occasionally using a direct quotation is fine, but most of the time you're using paraphrasing, so whatever you've read into your own words. And that, I think, is a really important part and a skill as well. So it might be a bit hard to do that in your first essay, in your second essay, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. And I found that it's also best to already, but again, that's my personal way of taking my notes, but the notes that I take are already paraphrased. So I never write down the exact phrasing from an article, but I already write it down paraphrased in my notes, just so that there's no danger of accidentally copying anything and not clearly saying where you have it from, because then that's plagiarism, which basically just means you're using someone else's ideas and not clearly marking them and kind of putting them out there as your own, which I found can be this big scary thing, plagiarism. And obviously, if you are found guilty of plagiarizing, there are certain consequences that you have to deal with, which can be quite, well, drastic, I guess. You could be excluded from university, couldn't you? But at the same time, so it's this big scary thing. But I mean, I don't know, in my 4 years, I've never heard of anyone in my course who's actually plagiarized, because as long as you properly cite and you paraphrase, it's quite hard. That's quite hard to do. Yeah, you just have to be careful.
I think, I mean, obviously, occasionally there might be 1 or 2 sentences in an essay where a student hasn't paraphrased enough. But if it's 1 or 2 sentences in something else, which is completely fine, then obviously it's not a problem. But as you said, Paula, is that as you're taking notes, if you're already writing it into your own words when you're taking notes, you don't plagiarize, because it's that process of you're not copying information, you're reading and you're processing the information and you're writing down what you understand and what you have learned from that information, and you then use that. It's a whole process, and it goes along with what you said about developing your knowledge and understanding of the topic. Whereas if you're just copying something and putting a direct quotation, you're not demonstrating any knowledge or understanding. You're demonstrating that you can copy and paste, which is a great skill to have.
Yeah, and I think what's important there as well is that kind of while you read, and as you said, you process it and you think about things, and that then it ties into with your writing, because in your head you start making connections between different ideas and how things relate to each other, and then that is just something that you can use when you write your essay, because obviously that needs to be in a logical structure as well. So it is really important that you don't just copy and paste and just try to put things together, but to actually think about them. I think, and that's another skill that I wanted to mention that kind of ties in here as well, is reflection, which I found to be really important, especially while you're reading and while you're researching. So kind of reflecting on what am I currently reading, how does this relate to other things that I've read, but also how does this relate to the assessment that I actually have to answer, because I do that sometimes, where you obviously get a task and you have something specific that your essay or report is meant to answer, but then while you read and you're reading broad and you're kind of drifting off into a slightly different direction and you're reading all these things and it's super interesting, but they don't actually help you really answer this assessment questions that you ask. So reflection is just like this ongoing process that's part of your academic writing as well, where you just think about how, first of all, what did I read, how does this relate to what I've done, but also, I've tried this style of taking notes, did that work for me or did that not? So I feel like reflection is a really important skill to have generally, but especially when it comes to academic writing.
Yeah, and I think that, again, it ties into so many other things that you've said, Paula, that you do change as you're studying, and from what you do in first year compared to what you're doing in fourth year, your style of note-taking, your style of studying, etc., will change.
Yeah.
And it's being brave enough to make those changes and not to think, oh, well, that means I've wasted time because that wasn't very good. Because it's not a waste of time, because you've learned from it and you've developed from it, and now you can do it a little bit differently or a little bit more effectively. And it ties in as well with reading. So you said sometimes you end up reading things which are super interesting but not relevant to the assignment. Don't just put them in because you read them, because then you end up losing marks because they're not relevant. It's better to be brave and think, okay, well, I spent 3 hours reading those articles, which I cannot use, but they've still broadened your knowledge.
Exactly.
And you might sort of at a later date come back to them and think, oh, they work for this assignment.
Yeah.
I remember reading those journal articles, and so never think of anything as a waste of time in that sense. It's all part of your learning and development, which is really important. I think you've come up with lots of kind of tips and tricks as we've been going along.
I know.
I know there's one thing you were going to talk about, breaking down the task, which I think is really important.
Obviously, yes, I've already said a few things that I've learned in my academic career, but some other final tips and tricks. Definitely breaking down the task. So as not necessarily as soon as you get the assessment and assessment criteria, but the first step in tackling any sort of academic writing assessment that you have is looking at your assessment criteria. So for each module assessment that you have, you get a separate sort of Word document where the lecturer puts all the information in that they want from you. So it's things like how many sources you have to have, a minimum, obviously the type of assessment that it is, and there's always going to be an assessment criteria, which is really helpful in just understanding what the lecturer wants you to do. As we already said, I think that keeping it relevant to what your lecturer wants is really important. Obviously, to a degree, or you always have a certain freedom, maybe in the topic specifically, that you can choose a specific issue that you can sort of research on. But at the end of the day, your essay needs to answer whatever question your lecturer wants you to answer. And breaking down the assessment there is really, really important. So first of all, for your understanding, but I think also just for planning your research, so knowing maybe what areas you have to research, maybe what specific phrases or keywords you have to define. And then also, I think you mentioned that already, kind of it really helps with your time management as well, because you know what you need to do. So yeah, breaking down the task, first step in any self-assessment that you are asked to do, and it's a really important one.
Yeah, and it really helps with what we said as well about the structure of your assignment, that if you understand what you have to do, then it helps you structure it, and it helps you have that clear structure in your mind. And I think structure is one of the key things in academic writing. It really is, that if you have a good structure that guides your reader and therefore your assessor through your assignment, you're more likely to get a good grade. You could have all the relevant points in your essay or in your report, but if you've not structured it clearly, they can get lost.
Exactly.
So taking the time to make sure that you have a clear structure which matches the task is
very important,
and really important. And just then within that, obviously making sure you use your notes from your reading effectively, that you're using the right style of language, the formal language, the right tone is all really important. But having that structure there, don't be afraid to look at your structure and think about restructuring before you submit an essay, because you can change things. So you might start with something and then think, actually, I can't see how these paragraphs really follow on from one another. How might I change that? And I think that's a good thing to look at as well. Do you agree?
100%. And that ties almost in with another sort of tip and trick that I have, is that kind of the importance of writing a draft. So once you have a couple of sources and you have taken some notes, just sort of start writing your essay or your report. Maybe let it sit for a wee bit, maybe have someone else read over it, and then go into it again and look at it with fresh eyes. Especially because you're so involved in the writing process. You've read, you've thought about it, everything in your head might make sense, but then bringing it out on paper can sometimes be a bit more difficult. So just writing a draft and then looking at it again after maybe a couple of days really helps with that, and then ties in with that as well. You may be seeing, oh, actually that doesn't link very well together, or maybe have to add some more sources here to support my argument. So and not being, as you said, not being afraid to make a change, and maybe even cutting out a paragraph because it doesn't fit in and it just boosts up your word count too much. Like, these are really important things to do, definitely.
I think we've kind of covered most of the main points.
We have.
Writing. I think obviously with the videos that you're going to be doing, the PALS leaders are going to be doing, that'll help explain things in more detail and visualize as well, because you're going to have images going with those.
Exactly. A bit more.
So can I maybe sort of summarize what I think then for writing?
Definitely. Go for it.
So we have the understanding the task and breaking it down, like Paula said, by looking at the assessment criteria, doing your reading and making sure that you're referencing while you're reading and taking notes and putting the notes into your own words so that you can use it in your essay. Planning, making sure that you've got a good structure for your essay and it is a clear structure with an introduction and the body paragraphs and the conclusion. And the conclusion is where you bring together all the ideas and present your perspective, as it were. Making sure that throughout all of that, when you're writing your essay, you are using your sources, you're sticking to your structure, and you're using a formal language and the right tone and the right style for academic writing, and you're citing throughout your writing as well. Usually, I don't think we've said this actually, but 2 or 3 sources in every paragraph that you're writing. It's really important to make sure you're getting a breadth of reading into your assignments. Not being afraid to change when things aren't right, and making sure that you do read through your drafts and proofread before you submit.
I think those are all the important points. And what I just want to say as well is also don't be afraid to ask for help. especially when you're maybe first starting out. Obviously, when you're at QMU, we have, advisors like Lisa at uni who can help you with this, but then maybe even at your home university, there's probably a similar sort of service, or maybe even sometimes it's just helpful to watch a YouTube video on, what is an essay. So there's different sources out there. And so if you ever feel stuck, know that there's loads of information and help out there. So don't be afraid to ask. But yeah, that was a really good conclusion that you did there with all the important parts. I think we've covered everything we can. And then, as we've said throughout the podcast already, so there's going to be different or other podcast episodes out there on other topics related to academic writing and generally academic skills that you might need. And then we're also going to have a couple of mini lectures, presentations, where we'll focus specifically on essays and reports. And so feel free to have a look at this as well if you need some help. Thank you so much, Lisa, for talking to me today. I think that was a really great conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
And then I hope everyone who listens to this has a lovely rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.